Hi, this is Matt McCormick. I'm in the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento. My email address is mccormick@csus.edu. And this is a short lecture on a fallacy that I'm naming as risk inversion. It's relevant to a number of critical reasoning, inductive logic, rationality, probability discussions I'm having in lots of my classes. All right, so let's talk about what I mean by risk inversion. I'm calling it confused and inconsistent risk assessment and response. That sounds technical, but the idea is familiar and you will immediately see what I'm getting at. So we unconsciously often adopt wildly inconsistent risk policies or behaviors. The familiar case you all know is about driving versus flying. So here's my sort of rough thumbnail definition for what I mean by risk inversion. And I've been thinking about this question for many years, been trying to really put my finger on this mistake. I haven't been able to find anybody who's described it in quite this way, so I'm just going to name it: the mistake of adopting a low threshold of risk for one activity or behavior while ignoring or accepting a much higher threshold of risk for another. So somebody's being wildly inconsistent. The example you all know is somebody who's too scared of crashes to fly a plane. Meanwhile, he drives his car around town every day, where plane crashes are, and forgive me, I'm going to use a bunch of numbers here to try to get our heads around this, and I'm going to use the per million benchmark for us to kind of calibrate and try to get our risk assessment lined up and consistent. So plane crashes, roughly 3.9 deaths per million. I won't go into the background here about what per million watts we're talking about, but per million people. So 3.9, almost 4 people per million people in planes, whereas driving a car, 124 deaths per million. So that's what 40 times higher. So this guy won't fly on a plane, but he'll go do something because he's afraid of some bad outcome, where he'll go do something 40 times more risky or 30 times more risky without a care in the world. So we often have, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody else because of a number of effects, we often have these wildly inconsistent risk avoidance policies about one thing while doing another. This is an example that actually happened to me in class years ago. There was a serial killer who had killed 4 people in Yosemite that year, and he was famously on trial. His name was Cary Stayner. He was on trial down in Stockton, and I went and looked it up, and it turns out there was 4 people who got murdered in Yosemite that year, and it had 4 million visitors. So literally, Yosemite had 1 death per million. And I had a student who said, I don't want to go to camp. I don't want to go camping in Yosemite. That serial killer killed 4 people there last year. Well, it turns out that there's 1 Yosemite death per million, 1 murder per million. Meanwhile, the student, she lived in Sacramento, where the murder rate was 70 deaths per million. That is literally 70 times higher to stay at your house in Elk Grove than to go to Yosemite. So rather than stay home, you should go to Yosemite right now if what you're worried about is murder rates. Or if you think that's an unacceptable murder rate, the place you live is currently unacceptable. Another example I like is somebody says, oh, I'm not going to go out there into the ocean and swim. There's a shark attack out there last year. So you look that up. It turns out there's 1 death by shark per 500 million people globally, whereas the same guy is sitting on the beach eating potato salad without a care in the world. But if you look that up, there's 1 death by botulism per 50,000. That is to say that potato salad is 10,000 times more dangerous than sharks, given the frequency of occurrence. All right, so we'll talk about what risk is in just a second and get that frequency notion sort of tightened up and clarified. Okay, so I'm calling these inversions where somebody's got these inconsistent policies or inconsistent behaviors where they accept it over here, but they reject it over there, even though one of them might be much more objectively dangerous. So somebody says, I'd never go skydiving, that's too dangerous. I looked it up, 7 deaths per million. Meanwhile, she goes skiing every winter, where that's 54 deaths per million. Right? So it's 8 times more dangerous to go skiing. The mistake then is applying inconsistent risk thresholds across different activities, behaviors. modifying your behavior in one case, perhaps missing out on significant benefits while not modifying your behavior in the other. Look, either the risk is acceptable or it's not, and you're adopting this inconsistent standard. Now, why is that bad? Well, inconsistency is irrational. If there's no principled or evidence-based or fact-based grounds on which to base the policy, then you might as well just throw darts at it. And look, if you think the risk is unacceptable in one case because of the nature of the harm or the probability of the harm, then why is it not acceptable in the other case? Why is it that you'll take it in one case, but you'll ignore the more risky activity in another? That doesn't make sense. It's irrational, and it's not defensible. You can't explain to somebody, oh, I'm doing it because. Well, then you would do it because in the other case too. You should either stop doing X or you should start doing Y. That is, you should either start skydiving and skiing, or you should neither ski nor skydive. And I won't tell you about where your threshold should be, but the inconsistent threshold where you accept one and not the other doesn't make any sense. To be consistent, to be rational, to maximize utility, you ought to be consistent across those both. Adopting a policy saves time, it saves energy, and an evaluation of resources too. So just a policy here can save you a lot of trouble, and it can prevent you from missing out on some important, valuable experiences or behaviors or rewards or upsides. Maybe think about it this way, very roughly speaking, without going into a lot of details. Think about how risky is it that you'll be struck by lightning. Your odds of being struck by lightning are about 1 in a million per year. Now, your intuition's probably, your risk threshold is probably that you don't spend much time worrying about being struck by lightning. So that's 1 per million. Maybe you can use that 1 per million number, depending on how you feel about it, as a way to kind of calibrate, okay, if that's an acceptable policy, then maybe I can get my other policies in line with that so that I'm not wildly inconsistent across these activities. Now, why do we ever accept risks of dangerous things or bad things happening to us? When is that okay? Because we can't say, I'm not going to take on any risk. Obviously, life is full of risks. There's always behaviors that you're going to engage in that involve some risk of something bad happening. Well, we do that because there's trade-offs. What are the trade-offs for accepting risk? What are the benefits? What are the possible gains? Driving obviously has huge bonuses that make the risk worth it. Like driving invokes a pretty significant chance of injury or death every time you go out, but there's an upside, and there's a probability, a pretty low probability the bad thing will happen to you, and the upsides make it worth it to you. So there's always this sort of trade-off between what am I getting from it versus what risk am I invoking. And flying, as I demonstrated earlier, improves on those bonuses even more, right? Whatever benefits there are to being able to drive, because you don't walk or ride a bike because it's safer. So you drive and accept the risk. Well, flying is even safer, and it amplifies or increases those benefits that you would have gained, that you gained from driving. Being able to go places far away, go there quickly, go there efficiently, and go there relatively cheaply. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what risk is without getting too technical. So I'm going to call risk is equal to probability times disutility. Okay, so the probability is how likely is it that this thing will happen. That's just the numbers about how often does it happen divided by the cases. And the disutility in expected value theory is just a way of thinking about how bad is it. So getting a cold or getting a minor side effect from a vaccine is not that bad, perhaps, but death is very bad. Let's call death being the worst possible, highest value disutility event that can happen. So we might attach a really high amount of disutility to death and a relatively low disutility to some side effect from, say, a vaccine. So we might add then sort of spell this out in English as how likely is it that the bad thing will happen? And you multiply that, that's just the probability, by how bad is the bad thing that might happen. So what is the consequence that we're looking at as a probable outcome? So an implication of this concept of risk is that you could have two interestingly different events have the same risk value attached to them. And here's what I mean. Suppose you're looking at some event that has a 10% probability of happening. So, and suppose the bad thing that happens is, let's call it 100 units of bad. Now, I don't care how we define this. People in expected value theory can define badness or goodness in any way you want. You can talk about money, you can talk about pain, you can talk about suffering. Just let me attach a value to it. So getting a hangnail maybe is minus 5 units of bad. Losing a finger is minus 100 units of bad, and maybe dying is 1,000 units of bad, or however you want to spell out those details. We worked this out in my Rationality Inductive Logic 2 class. So now, when you multiply 10% times minus 100, you get an expected value of minus 10. So here's an event that has, on average, a minus 10 disutility value to it. That's how bad it is. That's what happens. 10% of the time, you get 100 units of bad, so that works out to be minus 10 per event. So that would mean, by implication, just the math here means that if you're considering some other event that only has a 1% probability of happening, but it's much worse, say it's 1,000 units of bad, then this consequence or this other prospect we're looking at would have an equivalent risk value. It would have an equivalent expected value of minus 10. So you've got two things considered, right? And I'm not going to pursue the details here at length, but this gives us a way to kind of apples and apples compare things, right? If you're looking at a very low probability of, say, some vaccine side effect happening, where the side effect is kind of bad, but it's not death, you can now take the probability multiplied by the disutility and get a value. And then you could compare, say, to not getting the vaccine, where there's a probability of some really bad thing happening, like, say, death, which is much worse. And we can do an apples to apples comparison of these two things, and we can decide which one's better or which one's worse. In this particular case, I've described two outcomes and probabilities where they're actually equivalent. So this would be a toss-up. You're going to see here in a minute when I show you a vaccine case how it's flagrantly not a toss-up with, say, COVID vaccines. Consistency, and just going to make a couple of other comments here. Consistency across different activities is important because consistency is rational, and I can make a much more detailed explanation of that in class or in one of my other lectures. A policy or approach that's based on evidence or facts is better than being idiosyncratic, arbitrary, or random. Look, if you're just deciding on a case-by-case basis and there's no principled or rule-governed or quantitative or empirically based or no evidence-based grounds on which you're making the choices between this activity and that activity and that activity, then you might as well just throw darts at it. I mean, why not go swimming with the sharks today and then avoiding driving a car tomorrow, or avoiding going out of the house because lightning might strike you. I mean, what's to keep you from adopting a wildly inconsistent policy that way? Because look, if there's no grounds, no principles, no evidence behind the whole thing, and if it's inconsistent across activities, then there's this sort of, that's partly what I mean by irrational. This is fundamentally irrational, that there's no rhyme nor reason to this person's behavior as they swing wildly back and forth across things that they find acceptable or unacceptable. Look, it's either acceptable or it's not. Either a minus 1,000 risk is bad or it's not, using my little quantification system. It's either acceptable to you or it's not. It doesn't make sense for you to refuse to go outside because of your fear of lightning, while you accept swimming with sharks in some other circumstance or some other case. It's irrational to ignore that risk in one case while steering your life, your activities, your behaviors, your relationships around in another. It also makes it really difficult for the rest of us to deal with you if your behavior doesn't fit to any kind of principles or reasons. Okay, so let's look at some other examples. One of the complicating factors here of problems is that people's risk assessments and worries are wildly out of line with the facts. Okay, so if risk equals probability times disutility, then you as a consumer of information, as an agent in the world who's trying not to die, not to get eaten by sharks, not to get struck by lightning, not to die from disease, you need to know and have good, clear information and accurate knowledge about, one, what is the probability, and two, what is the disutility. Without that information, you're going to get it wrong. I'm arguing that you need to know those to get it right, and if you don't know them, then you're going to be all over the map. And people are predictably and they're particularly bad at assessing both of these. They're bad at determining probabilities, and they're bad at determining what the disutilities are. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why and where that happens. So for example, terrorism numbers. And the chart on the right shows a Gallup poll of people, Americans, about how worried are you about terrorism. And you can see the numbers swinging wildly from not very worried at all in, say, year 2000 to obviously much more worried about terrorism right after 9/11. And then in the last 5-10 years, there are worries about terrorism creeping up. You know, one of the central concerns in people's minds coming up to a presidential election, for instance, is terrorism. What are we going to do about terrorism? Well, the odds of you dying from terrorism are astronomically unlikely, right? That's 1/3 the amount of lightning. Are you worried about lightning? Well, terrorism is only a third as risky as lightning, assuming the same sort of outcome. By contrast, potato salad, 20 people per million. So you've got orders of magnitude difference between the dangers of terrorism versus the dangers of potato salad. The danger of asthma, 15 per million. Nobody's worrying about that. That's not very sexy. That's not very interesting. But it's, what is that? 10, 20, 30 times more dangerous than terrorism. That is to say, potato salad is 70 times more dangerous than terrorists, but that's not something you're worried about in the presidential election, although maybe you should. Maybe this will make you think maybe we should have better standards for food safety coming out of the USDA, because the USDA and those standards for what constitutes safe practices for making, buying, selling, packaging, distributing potato salad is a much more pressing problem by the numbers, by the deaths, than terrorism is. But these things get wildly inflated and distorted in people's heads. Nobody's worried about potato salad, but they're very worried about terrorism. Okay, so I got to do it. I know this is sensitive these days, but here's the case that really motivated me to want to make this lecture and talk about this problem. The mother of all risk inversion cases is people being opposed to or anti-vaxxers about COVID vaccines. And I'll just give you a simple example. And I hope this is not too controversial. I hope you'll see what I'm getting at. So recently, and this is all changing quickly as we go through the pandemic, but as of this recording, the rate of people who die per million who get COVID is roughly 17,000 per million people. So that is, when you get 1 million people who have COVID, 17,000 of them will die. Okay, now you can imagine where this is going. I'm going to keep using my per million comparison case. So there were a number of people, and there was a concern in the news for a while about the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine. There was some small chance, it turns out, of there being a side effect from the J&J COVID vaccine of getting non-lethal blood clots from that vaccine. The risk rate on that, as I understand it, was about 7 per million. Okay, so notice, blood clots are non-lethal and easily treatable. And this is not figuring in the benefits that you gain from the vaccine, but there were lots of people saying, oh, I don't want to get the vaccine because you could get blood clots from that. Okay, you might get blood clots from that vaccine at a rate of 7 per million, but the alternative course of action you're considering, namely risking COVID, if you get COVID, now your chances are 17,000 per million of dying in this case. So it's not even just a treatable blood clot case, it's that you'll be dead. 17,000 per million will be dead versus 7 per million will have some easily treatable side effect. So you can see how the avoidance, the risk avoidance in the vaccine case is completely out of whack by the numbers with the probability of death or the risk of death in the case of COVID. So roughly, as of this recording, 34 plus million Americans out of 330 million have had it. That's about 15% of the population. That's astronomically high. It's a public health disaster on like we haven't seen in decades or maybe centuries. For reference here, just kind of keep your head around the numbers. That's roughly. The number of people who have died is about 700,000 people in the United States, which is roughly equivalent to 1.5 times World War II, right? So just to keep your sort of perspective on what's bad and what's not bad, COVID's bad. COVID's a World War II and a half bad. That's how bad it is. World War II, widely considered to be one of the worst sort of public health disasters, if you will, in the 20th century for Americans. Just one of the worst things that happened in the entire century. And COVID is now 1.5 times as bad as that for Americans. Just to keep our sort of calibration sensibilities clear about what's going on. Okay, so again, risk inversion is the mistake of adopting a low threshold of risk for one activity or behavior while ignoring or accepting a much higher risk in another case. The solution here that I'm suggesting is you should figure out your level of risk aversion. You should apply a consistent risk policy across activities and behavior. You should get good information about how probable is the bad outcome and how bad is the bad outcome, and then try to act more accordingly, according to a more rational, consistent principle, whatever that might be. I won't presume to tell you what level of risk is acceptable to you, but I will point out that you're being wildly inconsistent if you refuse to do that activity, but you accept that activity when they're risk inverted. If you won't get the vaccine, and forgive me, this is a bit of an exaggeration for rhetorical effect probably, but if you think the vaccine is above your acceptable risk policy for things you won't accept, then it looks like no driving, no flying, no alcohol, no skiing, no swimming, no sex, no going out to bars, no pregnancy, no skydiving, no smoking, no red meat, no skateboarding, or rock climbing for you, if you're going to be consistent here. Now, I won't presume to tell you, but it seems to me that you probably find lots of those activities to be perfectly acceptable. So you're adopting this attitude that I don't want to get the vaccine because it has this astronomically low chance of doing something bad to me. Doesn't make any sense. It's utterly irrational. And it means you can't adopt, if you're going to be consistent, you can't accept any of those behaviors. Okay, so I'll say a few words about what's going on. Why do we do this? What's happening when we do it? I'm just going to allude to a whole bunch of pretty well-defined, well-researched phenomena in the human cognitive system that comes out of the biases and heuristics literature. You look at Kahneman, Tversky, Gilovich, Geiger-Renzer, a whole bunch of other important behavioral psychologists, where they've come up with a bunch of good analyses about what's going on. Why do we do this? Why do we flip these around? Kahneman calls one of these mistakes the focusing illusion. That is, when you're thinking about it, you're focusing your attention on it. Things are rarely as important as they seem when you're thinking about them. When you're thinking about those blood clots, you're thinking about that vaccine, that often makes you inflate the probability much higher, or the risk more than you should. There's a lot of motivated reasoning going on here, and what I'd encourage you to go do is go look up the Wikipedia page or one of my other lectures about motivated reasoning, what these are and how they work. We often have a preferred conclusion in mind that we build our rationalizations to support. There's a lot of that going on, say, with the COVID vaccine stuff recently. We're all quite guilty very often of confirmation bias, which is the mistake of selecting evidence that supports your view while neglecting disproof. There's a lot of tribalism going on here with this politicization of vaccines, for example. Humans are primates with strong emotional tribal affiliations that drive their reasoning, that makes them give justifications for things that fit into their tribal affiliations. There's something that Kahneman calls the affect heuristic, and what happens is that we very often substitute a question like, is X safe, with a different question, and then we answer the other question, do I have positive or negative feelings about X? How do I feel about it? And that's what I use to measure whether or not it's actually safe. And we do this often without really thinking about it. There's a phenomenon called entrenchment, where people dig in deeper on their views when faced with counter evidence, especially when these are public views that they've stated and sort of publicly gone on record about, where they'll just dig in and believe it even more. So it's a strange behavior where somebody says X is true, and you show them, and they say it out loud in front of their friends and family, and say it's so, it's socially known or on Twitter or someplace, and they get shown counter evidence for it, and rather than change their mind and lose face and say, oh, I was wrong about X, they just double down and dig in deeper and refuse to give it up. A lot of that's happened with some of these cases we're looking at. And I'll cite, or I'll direct you to a really great New Yorker magazine article called Why Facts Don't Change Our Minds. There's a lot of research out there from some people arguing that we aren't really built to gather all the evidence and conclude on the basis of truth. And that New Yorker magazine cites a bunch of recent influential books that talk about what and why, how is our human cognitive system built, and what's it built for, and how does it work, and it's not really built to do what we need it to do in these kinds of risk assessment cases. And there's also this thing that Kahneman calls the possibility effect, which is just that humans exaggerate small probabilities. This leads people to buy lottery tickets when they shouldn't. It leads them to think about the prospect of winning millions of dollars, and they go and buy that ticket even though the odds are astronomically unlikely that they'll win. Okay, so just to recap, risk inversion is the mistake of adopting a low threshold of risk for one activity or behavior while ignoring or accepting a much higher risk for another. It's inconsistent. What happens is, I think, is that we go with our intuitions about risk, our feelings, but the answer here is to zoom out and take the long view, consider the base rates, look at the real numbers about how often is this happening per million, for example, and then apply a consistent standard of risk across the board. We ought to strive to resist this focusing illusion, resist motivated reasoning, resist confirmation bias, the affect heuristic, entrenchment, the possibility effect. It'd do us all well to understand what those are and then catch ourselves doing those and try to redirect. And that's it. That's my analysis of what's going on when people do this strange flipping or inconsistent behavior around risks in their lives.